years old. We are certainly pleased to have you here at this centennial birthday commemoration in recognition of General Lewis B. Hershey's distinguished service to his country. We are proud at Tri-State University to have General Hershey as our alumnus. Gentlemen, you may be seated. Between 1984 and 1990, I served as the chief academic officer at this institution, and in June and July, we bring new students to the campus, and together with their parents, put them in an auditorium where I had an opportunity to give them a welcome. Being a historian, I always like to look over at this building and point out to them that on June 17 in 1884, there was an assemblage on the second floor of this building, and that summer classes began. And that on May 17, 1 month earlier, my grandmother was born. And then I would pause and I'd say, both are doing fine. And always the parents did that, and the students kind of looked at me sort of funny. Well, Lewis Hershey attended classes in this building. It certainly wasn't as it looks now. This building has new parts. Grandmother only made it to 1989. If they'd given her new parts, I'm sure she'd still be doing well also. My wife buys more things at antique stores and flea markets than I make. She out there somewhere. I'm only kidding. She once found this postcard. And so I'm going to pass this around the audience. I hope it doesn't distract our speaker. But as you see this postcard, it's from a female student to a friend of hers in Wabash, urging her to come visit her. And as you look at this campus, you can imagine that you're Lewis Hershey coming from the east to the west with your books in hand, ready to do business with your instructors. This is Tri-State College when Lewis Hershey was here. Now, it's not true that Glenn Radcliffe was here as Professor Hershey's instructor, but Glenn Radcliffe, as many of you know, served this campus long and in just about every capacity that there is. And we're proud to have him as a professor emeritus, and we're proud to introduce him now to give an invocation.
I didn't start the university. I came here a year after it was started. Let us all be reverent in the spirit of prayer just now. Almighty God, we're here today to remember a friend, a devoted and a dedicated United States citizen. And as one biographer says of him, the homespun earthy Hoosier, one who faithfully served his country as a member of the United States Army, one who gave much to many, moving up through the ranks to that of a four-star general. And then on November the 3rd, 1969, the United States Senate confirmed his promotion to full General Army of the United States. Our friend walked with men in high positions, both in American and foreign countries. He received many awards. And to speak of a personal friend, General B. Hershey, that's what we're talking about. One who never forgot where his roots were firmly planted in Jamestown Township, Steuben County, Indiana. His contribution to friends and loved ones alike were wide and colorful. He leaves a beautiful memory. His philosophy would be well for many, including each one here today, to emulate. He was proud of one. He was proud of his heritage. And Lord, we thank you for the General Army of the United States, Lewis Blaine Hershey. Amen.
We're very pleased to have here this afternoon with us from his home in Spring Mills, Pennsylvania, the chairman of our Board of Trustees, Dr. William Geddick. Dr. Geddick is a graduate of Tri-State University, mechanical engineer. Dr. Geddick.
Thank you, Jim. Honored guests, friends of the university, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our campus today. I'm fortunate enough to have this honor to welcome you for such an illustrious alumnus, because our president is now winging his way to Scandinavia to bring some students to this campus. When he asked me if I would stand in for him today, I was greatly honored. And I hope that you enjoy this afternoon as much as I will in reminiscing and thinking about probably the most noted and notable Tri-State alum that's ever trod the campus. So I thank you very much for coming. I look forward to enjoying the afternoon along with you. And thank you again for helping us celebrate General Hershey's birthday today. 100th birthday. Am I right? Right. I have been associated with General Hershey, but I think the letter said greetings, as I recall. And that was a long time ago, and I quickly enlisted in the Navy. So I'm a World War II guy. I recognize here on the Marine a few bars here. We used to have Marines on the battleship, but they weren't too happy. I don't think they wanted to get into the fray, and they were kind of parading around the ship taking care of the admiral. But in any case, I'm very happy to see someone here who may have been in World War II. I don't think there's too many here that have been. Thank you very much.
Our speaker this afternoon, George Flynn, is no stranger to many of you in the audience. A graduate of Louisiana State University and currently professor of history at Texas Tech University, Professor Flynn has devoted much of his scholarly work to the biographical study of General Hershey and to the workings of the Selective Service system. Among his several articles and books on Hershey and Selective Service is Louis V. Hershey, Mr. Selective Service, and most recently, published just this year, The Draft, 1940-1973. I might add, for the benefit of the military persons in the audience, that Professor Flynn was assigned to the adjutant, you notice I stumble when I say that, being a former military person, Adjutant General Corps of the United States Army from 1964-1966, and he served as a captain in the reserves from 1966 to 1968. Professor Flynn.
This isn't working, so we'll ignore that. Well, I thank you very much for inviting me, and I thank Professor Zimmerman and Dr. Ratcliffe and Dr. Getty for having me as part of this program. It's a pleasure for me to be here because I come from a regular academic year in which I have to face 300 freshmen sometimes who aren't really interested in whatever I'm saying. But you're all here and you're interested in hearing about this, so it's my pleasure. And I hope that sometime I'll get a chance to see that little postcard that's going around. It's a local postcard, it's not a French postcard. I'm sure that there'll be plenty of people here who will be able to correct some of the details of my remarks, since I use them for the information initially, and I probably got it wrong, but afterwards we can discuss where I went wrong. All right? The keynote speaker is supposed to sort of set an occasion for a convention. As we know, though, many people use a keynote address to launch their own political career. But there is an essential issue, it seems to me, when we try to understand Louis Hershey and his contributions to American history. And I think service is the term that we could latch on to, not just selective service, but national, international service, universal service, to the country and to his fellow man. And so I'm going to examine briefly, in 30 minutes hopefully, a career that spanned several decades and 6 presidents, and ended here in Angola on the 20th of May 1977, as though he sort of completed a circle. He began here and he came here and died. And 100 years ago today, he was born on a farm and raised by his father, latter Fraley Hershey, and his mother, Rosetta Richardson Hershey. She died when he was still very young, and before he entered school, in fact. Now, one of the strengths of this country, I suppose, is that you can't really predict where you're going to get leadership from, and this isn't the most likely area in the country to produce a man who's going to be the mobilizer of military manpower in the 20th century. But I guess the general would disagree with me. He would say that actually it was this land and this rural area that gave him the values that made his leadership possible. And what did he get out of his young career here in northeastern Indiana that proved so valuable in his later career? Well, it certainly wasn't farming, because he couldn't get away from that fast enough. He escaped the family farm as soon as possible. After graduating from Fremont High School in 1910, in a senior class of less than a dozen students, he attended Tri-State here and obtained a teaching certificate. He did this in the summer, and he was teaching elementary school then, and he re-entered Tri-State and supported himself by working as a deputy sheriff. His father was sheriff of the county at the time. And he played basketball here at Tri-State. In those days, you couldn't support yourself by playing college basketball, so he had to have another job. But by 1914, he had earned 3 different bachelor's degrees from this institution in science, arts, and pedagogy. And I think what he got out of all this, of course, was an enormous confidence in his ability as a student, because I remember when I came here to look at his academic record, and I was very impressed with it. He performed admirably as a student in all subjects, math and education, English. He was an A student. So he came out of that with confidence in his intellectual ability. Undoubtedly, working as a deputy sheriff gave him confidence, too, in the ability to handle problems. So he came out confident of his ability to function in our society. And from 1914 to 1916, he served as principal of a high school, Flint High School, in the area. But his leadership skills, I think, were also honed by membership in the Indiana National Guard. In 1916, he enlisted, and rapidly his unit was federalized to march down to the Mexican border and protect us Texans against those dangerous Mexicans who were threatening us at that time. But during his career in the National Guard, he was elected to first lieutenant. In those days, they elected their officers. So this spoke to the recognition of his ability by his peers. Well, after several months fighting the mosquitoes and boredom in southern Texas, where I can reliably report people are still fighting mosquitoes and boredom, he had plans for obtaining a graduate degree in education from Indiana University in Bloomington. And he did enter IU and begin his studies. Unfortunately, America entered World War I at that time, which had begun, of course, earlier, but we didn't get in until 1917. And he left the dorms in Bloomington to serve as a first lieutenant in Battery C of the 137th Field Artillery Unit, and went into training at Camp Shelby, Mississippi. He seems to have visited some very wonderful places during his military career. But while at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, he married Ellen Dygert, who was his childhood sweetheart, and would remain at his side for almost 60 years, from rural Mississippi to receptions in the White House. She died in April of 1977. To his disappointment, Hershey did not see combat in World War I. He was promoted to captain in October 1917, and he arrived in France just as the war was ending. But he extended his tour for 11 months to see a bit of the world, and he did travel throughout Europe. He worked mainly at Brest, France, dreadful weather. But one of the things that obviously occurred to him was that he quite liked the military life. He liked the companionship, the male bonding, the responsibility. All of this appealed to him. And the opportunity to operate on a larger theater, a national or an international theater, was something that also had its appeal. So it was quite clear to him by that time that he was not coming back to northeastern Indiana to enter education. He was going to remain in the service if he could. And there was every reason to expect that he could, because his reports, his efficiency reports were outstanding. And when he returned to the United States and applied for a regular Army commission, he received it. And so on 1 July 1920, he begins his career in the regular Army as a captain. For the next 16 years, he moves from one isolated Army post to another without any promotion. He raised a family during those years, 4 children, and of course all here. I'm sorry I didn't mention them in the beginning, but I certainly remember the hospitality of Gilbert and Catherine, and I'm glad to see Ellen and George here, the children of General Hershey. And he also played polo during this period. Artillery officers at this time were mounted. In fact, of course, artillery was still mounted in World War II. German artillery was mounted, horse-drawn. But one of the things they did was they played polo with their horses. Unfortunately for Lewis, in November 1927, during a polo match, he was hit by a wayward mallet and lost his sight in his left eye. But despite this handicap, he continued his military career and went to Command General Staff College in Fort Leavenworth, and then the Army War College at Pennsylvania, Carlisle Barracks, where he once again demonstrated outstanding competence in the academic aspects of the military career. And after 15 years as a captain and a short bit of duty at Fort Shafter in Hawaii, he was promoted to major in July 1935. This is not exactly incredible progress of military advancement in 15 years, but in a peacetime army, promotions don't come very rapidly. And when they do come, of course, they come very rapidly indeed. And his promotion career would skyrocket. So if you were looking at it as a stock, it was moving very level for a long time, and then all of a sudden it explodes off the board. He was assigned in September of 1936 to the General Staff of the War Department for duty as Secretary of the Joint Army and Navy Selective Service Committee. And this really begins his career in manpower mobilization, his specialty, the thing that he will master. And this committee, the Joint Army Navy Selective Service Committee, had been established in the 1920s, the mid-1920s, by the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of War and the Secretary of the Navy. They had exchanged letters to try to continue planning for mobilization in the event of another war. In World War I, we had a draft system, a selective service system. It was run by the Provost Marshal, but after the war, it was immediately demolished, and everybody went home. But the General Staff wanted to plan in the event that there might be another war. And that's what this Joint Committee did. And as Secretary of this committee, he begins to get the experience and the knowledge that will serve him for the rest of his career. It's while working at this post that he mastered the many details surrounding this paradox that we still have trouble adjusting to, the paradox of the need to force people to serve in a democracy. And his work involved travel to every state, contact with the reserve units that had been created in the various states, and throughout he makes many contacts throughout the country. And he also began to sharpen a latent skill in political sensitivity, because he was putting together a plan, you see, that no one really wanted. This was an idea that ran counter to the whole impulse of our culture, that we would be forced to do something. It's against our libertarian instincts, our individualistic instincts. And essentially what he was doing was trying to sell the Koran in Vatican City. So it was a difficult process and one that required considerable political tact, and continues to require that, I'm reliably told, by people trying to keep the system alive today. Well, out of this planning came eventually, of course, the Selective Service Training and Service Act of September 1940. And this bill was the conscription bill through which the United States mobilized its manpower in World War II. And, of course, it was passed before the war began, which was quite remarkable because no one expected us to adopt conscription before we actually had gone to war. We hadn't done it before. And, but it was a tribute to Hershey and also to a group of civilians who lobbied Congress for this measure. And during this time, Hershey became a regular visitor on Capitol Hill and began establishing the relationships that would serve him for the next 30 years. He became known as the expert on conscription, and he was the expert on conscription. The civilians who were also working for it had a different kind of conscription system in mind, mainly more of a universal training system, military training system, sort of a boot camp to make sure the boys knew how to make the bed and shine their shoes. But Hershey's testimony and conversations with congressmen guarantee that when the bill finally did pass, it resembled the measure that the military people had been planning since the mid-20s. Well, his knowledge was praised by everyone in Congress and by the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and so when the system was set up, he was made deputy director, and then in July of 1941, made director, and he stayed in that position until February of 1970. This was his career. How did it work out? Well, during World War II, the United States drafted some 13 million men, and it was universally praised for the operations of the draft. Both civilians and military leaders had praise for this achievement. George Gallup, who had begun his great career of feeling our pulse in 1936, had polled the Americans repeatedly during World War II on how Selective Service was doing, and he admitted he was amazed, in fact, that the Selective Service system received such a uniformly high approval rating from American people. After all, they were taking boys out of homes, and yet mothers and fathers were still saying that the Selective Service system was fair and well run. So it was an incredible achievement to operate such a system and still maintain the public favor. So the draft was a success, and as the draft succeeded, so did General Hershey, and he was no longer a major, you'll notice, because he reached lieutenant colonel in August of 1940, and then brigadier general in October 1940. It was a very short career as lieutenant colonel, and then a major general in April 1942. And then you see this, his general rank comes rather quickly. Well, the system had to find men for the armed forces, find fighting men, but it also had to organize and run a system of deferment, because after all, the term selective service meant that not everyone was supposed to serve in the military capacity. Some people were supposed to serve in other capacities, and deferments had to be created for these people. This was a very sticky wicket, and it would always remain so. But he administered that program as well as an alternate service program for conscientious objectives, because the law had been changed to recognize this in a formal way. In World War I, it was an informal arrangement, and the military did most of the handling of COs. In World War II, conscientious objectives were recognized, and they were allowed to perform alternate service. And Selective Service was in charge of that program, a real headache. And it was difficult to satisfy everyone in this area, but he ran the program honestly and fairly. And then finally, of course, he supervised the reemployment of veterans, because under the law, you were guaranteed a position when you came back out of the service. And he stayed in that business for a short time after the war. All through this period, his political sophistication is growing, and he becomes a master in dealing with the self-centered, sometimes narrowly focused men that we see on Capitol Hill and in the executive department. I suppose you have to be narrowly focused and self-centered if you're going to run for office and convince everyone that they should vote for you. I mean, you can't have a fragile ego and adopt that kind of political career. But it presents problems when you have to deal with these people. And he mastered the tactics necessary to deal with them. Also, civilian interest groups and the military. Of course, the military had its share of prima donnas and self-centered people, and essentially they thought that they should decide all issues during war. And he had to balance these various interests. I think one key to his success in doing this was his own decided lack of what the British call side, or self-centeredness. That is, what you saw was what you got. And he was not on an ego trip in his career. He was at pains to accept blame for failure, but equally ready to attribute all credit for success to his little group of neighbors, as he referred to the local draft boards in every county in the United States. 6,000 some odd such draft boards were the ones that did the immediate work of induction. So to most politicians, Hershey had a great appeal because he was a decidedly unmilitary general. And he spoke not in the idiom of West Point or Napoleonic adages, but rather in small-town American idioms. And he was endless in his praise of the wisdom of local citizens. This went very far in Congress. After the end of World War II, the draft system continued for a short period. After all, we did have the responsibility for occupying certain countries that had been defeated, and there had to be new people sent over to replace the boys who wanted to get home. In fact, the boys who were rioting to get home. Mothers wanted them back home, but they wanted to return rapidly as well. So we had to continue the draft for a short time. But as in World War I, there was enormous pressure and desire to just end this unfortunate thing, this un-American thing of pulling young men away from their families and sending them off in uniforms to learn nasty habits in military barracks. And so it wasn't so much of a surprise that the system was eventually ended, but it did continue for a while. There was a certain irony in this tension about the continuation of the system, because at the same time that all the boys wanted to come home and all the politicians wanted to end conscription, the United States was really assuming a new position in the world, one that they had not assumed before, and that was as leader of what was to become known as the free world, or certainly the Western world. And on a rhetorical level, the United States was assuming such a position of leadership. I mean, Truman was telling Russia to shape up or expect worse treatment. He was telling the British they had to pay off their debts, the French to get their act straight. At the same time, the American military, that is the muscle that would stand behind all of this bluster, was being degraded at a rapid rate. And so Hershey saw this contradiction and worked diligently to have the president try to make the draft a permanent part of the national defense system. But Truman, although himself a small-town American, much preferred to adopt something called universal military training. UMT had been around and would continue to be kicked around in the political arena for many years, and essentially it meant that idea of bringing the boys in and giving them some shaping up physically and teaching them how to make a bed and shine their shoes, some good hygiene, and also maybe giving them some citizenship lessons. That would never get passed, but this was Truman's idea, and he preferred that to an actual conscription into military units. Neither Congress nor the public had any interest in such an idea. So men rushed home to start families, buy homes, and go to school with funds provided by the GI Bill. Surprisingly, even the War Department preferred to end conscription and fought against Hershey's ambitions. The War Department's ambitions, of course, were to become as professional as any other profession. And it was always a source of embarrassment to some military leaders and thinkers. For example, Little Hart, a British military thinker and strategist, Captain Little Hart, was absolutely opposed to conscription in England because he felt that it degraded the professionalism of the military man. The idea that you could simply take people in and train them for 12 weeks and make soldiers out of them. I mean, his idea was that the military should be considered on the same professional level, for example, as a physician or a lawyer, someone who has taken years and years to achieve this. Right? So the military did want to go all professional certainly from 1946 on. So with all this opposition, then it's not surprising that in March of 47, the draft law expires. However, there was a little sop thrown to the general in that an office of Selective Service Records was maintained. This was supposed to be simply an agency that was to kind of administer the dispersal of all the thousands and thousands of records that had been developed through the draft. But in fact, what General Hershey did was to use this agency to continue training reservists in the various states for what he considered to be a future use. He expected to be a future use. Well, in the meantime, Congress votes down the UMT idea. The Army discovered that, remarkably, volunteers were too scarce to man units even at reduced levels. And in Europe, of course, the Soviet Union was proving recalcitrant in its diplomatic dealings with the United States. Soon Eastern Europe was under the control of Moscow, and there was talk heard of the spread of communism throughout the world. This was brought home to many people when in February 1948, Czechoslovakia became a stool of the Soviet powers, and the civilian government was kicked out. As this happens, and by February 48, the United States Army had declined from 7.5 million in 1946 to 1.4 million in 1948. Well, we are still talking tough to the Russians, but as General Marshall would say, it's tough to talk tough when you have only one effective division that you can threaten with. Right? And so talk was then heard about renewing the draft. And in July of 1948, Selective Service was reborn as a temporary expedient. The idea was that, in fact, it was going to scare people into volunteering for the military. And draft calls were very low for the next 2 years. But in June of 1950, of course, all of this changes because North Korea invades South Korea. And President Truman sees this as a direct challenge to the United Nations, as a step in the Soviet ambitions of world conquest, and responds accordingly. And as American forces are mobilized, General MacArthur discovers that his garrison units in Tokyo are not adequate to stem North Korean T-34 tanks racing down the peninsula, and we have to, of course, strip Europe and even our reserves in the United States. And so, once again, we need lots of men, not just atomic bombs or planes. And so the draft is reinstituted. And once again, General Hershey will supervise a very smooth conscription. Now, there were some changes in the Korean War draft, but it's interesting to observe the Korean War draft because, you see, this is a limited war. It's going to be unpopular eventually. Most limited wars are popular in the beginning, but if they go on for too long, they become unpopular. And Korea became unpopular eventually as well. But we don't have the same kind of opposition to conscription during the Korean War as we see during the Vietnamese conflict, although that's another limited war. But one of the problems was that there's a rotation system. You see, in World War II, of course, you were drafted for the duration, and you served for the duration. But in Korea and then in Vietnam, you're drafted for only 2 years, and you may only serve 1 year in the zone of combat. So you had to keep replacements coming constantly. Another major problem that he had to deal with, and that was resolved rather smoothly, was the integration of the armed forces. I mean, the Selective Service system had, in fact, already ended racial tags on all of its forms even earlier. During World War II, I don't want to take too much time here, but I mean, he, in fact, had fought with the Army about ending this because it was a dreadful difficulty drafting people by race. And this had been done, of course, in World War II. But it would not be done in the Korean War. And Hershey had fought against this from the very beginning. And another new problem, of course, was conscience objectives. No longer are they going to have alternate service run by Selective Service. They're going to arrange to work on their own. And finally, a new deferment system was put into place, one that would later cause all kinds of headaches for the system. But once again, the system received high marks from the public, the Congress, and the military. In April of 1953, the polls reported that 60% of the American public gave the draft board a high vote of confidence. So with the armistice in Korea in July of 1953, we see the same pattern repeating itself. Reduced calls on the draft, calls for ending the draft. But Hershey is able to continue his role as head of selective service and adopt a new mission for the system. In the period after the Korean War, he administers a deferment system to channel manpower into areas of national interest. Now, this deferment system had been designed in the Truman administration initially. Truman had been very impressed with the importance of science in winning the victory in World War II. Some people have suggested that they had won it single-handedly. And, of course, the atomic bomb had been a very impressive event and certainly illustrated the magic of science. And so the idea was that we couldn't afford to simply draft these scientists and make them riflemen. They had to be protected and allowed to design even more destructive weapons. And so we needed a system to protect them, and Hershey was responsible under a Truman mandate for developing such a system. Well, of course, he, with the flexibility that he demonstrated throughout his career, turned to the academic community for advice on how to set up such a system. What would be the best way to protect special, brainy young men? The whole idea, of course, was a violation of the notion of universal service. So it had to be done in a very delicate fashion. But there was a consensus in the academic community that you couldn't simply discriminate against physicists. You couldn't defer a physicist and not defer a historian. That seems reasonable to me. And so the idea was that we would not defer you by subject, but instead by simply ability. If you were a good history student, you were deferred as well as you're a good physics student. But the irony of this system that was designed was that it really followed the thinking very, very carefully of the academicians who were brought in, and these were some high-powered people. I mean, John Galbraith, for example, served on this advisory system, and others. And they designed the system, and everyone agreed at this meritocracy idea that these people were so potentially useful that they needed to be protected. Of course, in very short order, in the 1960s, these same academicians are going to be damning this particular system because of its discrimination, its unfairness. I mean, it's one thing to let the people stay at home when no one's being shot, I suppose. But the general had, in fact, designed the system with their advice. Now, he didn't like the idea of going away from universality, but he had to do it because of a mandate from the president, and also, very frankly, because he simply had too many 18-year-olds coming up. The demographic patterns in this country were such that by the 50s and the early 60s, we had a large number of 18-year-olds that were eligible, and at the same time, the needs of the military were declining. So what are you going to do with these people? The French are facing the same system right now. They still have what they call service national, or conscription, but they don't have any place for these people in the military. So they send them off to coach tennis and do a lot of other things. So, I mean, that's all right as long as no one's getting killed. But he understood that this was a difficult system and that it had the potential for great problems. But the draft calls remain low and the cohort of new 18-year-olds climbs. Now, in the 60s, of course, the problems with this will become manifest. With the conflict in Vietnam, Hershey found new priorities imposed by the Johnson administration. Inductions expanded, deferments now had to be cut. After a decade of liberal deferments, such a reversal provoked protests. Middle-class America began to feel the pressure of fighting a hot war in Asia. Significantly, as the draft expanded its operation, began to draft people from college, people who were not good students in college, disillusionment with the Vietnamese conflict grew, and the middle class becomes alienated. That's always a bad sign politically. Well, the general at this point was convinced that the protest against the draft, the various demonstrations that he had to be submitted to and that his local boards were submitted to, that this was all the work of a minority. And he unfortunately, I think at this point, sort of lost a bit of his touch because he played in the hands of his critics by dismissing them out of hand. And that, of course, just enraged them even further and made him more and more a target instead of Johnson or the war in Vietnam. He became an easy target because he was so visible and he was always ready with a statement about the situation. And the press, of course, would soon turn these into an agenda, and soon they had transformed the general into a sort of a monster, a symbol of an oppressive government fighting an immoral war in Vietnam. And the general was still using terms that made sense to his generation, and it made sense to the generation of World War II. But those phrases didn't make the same sense to a new group with a new agenda. President Johnson, of course, was also a target for protest. And Johnson had very little patience with these critics. And at one point after a demonstration in Washington, he directed the general, or the action, can't we do something about these protesters, many of whom, of course, were college students and still had deferments. And the general suggested that these deferments were at the government's convenience, and it certainly wasn't a convenience to the government to have them protesting and shutting down the Pentagon. So a natural thing should be to simply remove their deferment. The trouble is that this sort of cause and effect relationship of protest and then losing your deferment smacked very, very much of abuse of government power, and that, I mean, the general did threaten to withdraw deferments from protesters, and congressmen and educators properly objected. I mean, this was not the mission of Selective Service to make people agree with policies in Vietnam, but to find people for the military. In a sense, the protesters, if they were violating the law, the proper situation was, of course, to use the civil courts to prosecute them. But because of Johnson's urgings, the general became involved in this particular affair, and it was very unfortunate from every point of view. Suddenly, the general, after being a master of the political situation, being praised by Republicans and Democrats alike, serving under Republican and Democratic presidents, all of a sudden becomes an issue in the 1968 presidential campaign, the last thing he wanted. Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, promised that if elected, he would certainly fire the general. Richard Nixon, the Republican, an old supporter of the general and of the Selective Service system, began to talk about the need to move to an all-volunteer force as soon as the problems in Vietnam were resolved. Well, Nixon, of course, wins the election, and the general realized that his days were numbered when this happened. Now, temporarily, of course, the system had to continue because of the needs for Vietnam. I mean, while Nixon is proceeding with his negotiations, he needs manpower to maintain his credibility in the area. So he can't act too quickly to end the draft. And certainly, Secretary of Defense Laird recommended against ending the draft. The issue, though, is that General Hershey is a political liability for President Nixon. I mean, by then, of course, the general was becoming rather advanced in his age, and his ability to relate to the youth culture was a problem. Of course, relating to the youth culture was a problem for anyone over the age of 40, and certainly President Johnson had his problems. But Nixon was a man, of course, that was more sensitive to these issues than many. If you ever have a chance to look at some of the Nixon papers, you'll see the Nixon White House spent 80% of his time on image issues, not what the substance of the problem was, but how is this going to be presented? How are we going to massage this? What kind of scenario how are we going to sell this? It was all image. And of course, the general did not have the proper image for the Nixon administration. He was candid, he spoke forthrightly, and he didn't seem to fit in with the new youth movement. And so it's not surprising that when the general resisted the Nixon reforms of the system, Nixon wanted to do two things in particular. One of the things he wanted to do was to end criticism by trying to have a national call so that every 19-year-old single male in the country would be drafted at the same time, whereas under the local board system, in some local areas, you see, they didn't have any single 19-year-olds, so they had to draft a 23-year-old. Right? And so it was an uneven distribution of calls because the local board system was decentralized. Nixon wanted a national call so that if you were 19 and single, no matter where you were going to be called before someone who was 18 and single. Or if you were 23 and single, you'd be called before someone who was married, no matter where you were in the country. Some local boards didn't have any single men. They might have to turn to married men without children. So he wanted that. But of course, that struck at the whole root of the decentralized selective service system, which had been the hallmark of it since it was designed, and which was what Hershey considered the strength of the system, the decentralized aspect. And so he resisted this effort by Nixon. Another thing Nixon wanted to do, of course, was to use computers. The general also resisted this. So after a lot of false marches, eventually in February of 1970, he promoted the general to full general rank and named him presidential advisor on manpower. This meant he got an office in the executive office building and a White House phone, but it didn't ring very much. And of course, in April 1973, the Army retired General Hershey after over 50 years of service. Well, as I said before, service was a keynote. Now, when we try to establish the importance of the general in American history, and I mean, as significant as he is for Tri-State College and this community, I think that we should also try to see him in a larger context, his significance in the history of our country. I think it's clear that it rests upon his service as head of the draft system. And it was an amazing demonstration of effective service. I mean, consider that he had spanned a move from total war to limited war, from a war with artillery to a war with missiles. Right? He had functioned effectively under 6 different presidents, some of whom had been born in the 19th century, as he had, and some of whom had been born in the 20th century and shaped by the 20th century. And during this, he had maintained the respect and confidence of every Congress from 1940, when he first appeared as a young major, to 1970, when he defended the existing draft system in Vietnam. When Nixon was trying to get rid of him, this was a consideration, that he was universally loved and respected in Congress. So he had to be finessed out. He simply couldn't be kicked out. Well, how had he managed this? Well, I think, I'm sure that some of you have your own answers for this. Let me suggest my ideas. One is, I think, the man himself. I mean, he put forth this public image of just a simple country boy, and that's all nonsense. Of course, he was extremely intelligent and sophisticated. He was a quick study of the millions of details of manpower, induction systems in a democracy, and quite simply, he knew much more about the system than anybody in Congress around. It's amazing in his testimonies in congressional hearings that these congressmen are asking him questions, you see, that are really silly. It means that they haven't read the law, you understand? So, I mean, just by reading the law, you'd be able to finesse these congressmen, right? Most of whom, I suppose, depend upon briefings from their aides. But he simply knew the details of the law and why it had been changed, when the sentiment of Congress when it had been changed. He knew the vote and everything else. So, I mean, they simply, as Senator Javits would say, a Republican, liberal Republican would say, well, I think General Hershey knows best on any question of manpower like that. And the same thing would be said by conservative. Right? He did know more than anyone else. Another thing I think that explains his durability was the enormous support that he had throughout the country from local leadership. Many of these local leaders, of course, served in the system. Hershey cultivated local leadership. I mean, the little group of neighbors, they were neighbors, okay, but they were also influential neighbors in the various local boards, as I suppose they are today, right? I'm told from some local board members that I've met during my visit here. I mean, Hershey used to talk about this in Jeffersonian terms, that the local boards represented creative federalism. And there's some exaggeration to this because, of course, there was national policy adopted, and the local boards were supposed to follow national policy. But still, the local board system was an amazingly decentralized system, considering the tremendous move toward centralization and concentration of power in the national government. I mean, this was a great contrast that, in fact, in these local communities, people were making fundamental decisions about whether people were going to live and die, fight or not fight. And it was your neighbors who were doing it, not just a faceless bureaucrat in Washington. So that was, it was true that was a source of strength. And in a sense, Hershey was a political leader of this tremendous constituency of these local leaderships in the various communities. I mean, the party had chapters in every community in the United States, And one thing that the party agreed upon it was the absolutely indispensability of General Lewis Hershey. Now, the same kind of emphasis appeared in Congress. His stress on local autonomy, this rang church bells for congressmen, especially congressmen who were tended toward a more federalistic disposition anyway. There's also, I think, in explaining his success, his political astuteness and personal charm. Now, that seems rather paradoxical for a man whose life is dedicated to finding fighting men, men to go out and kill, as he would say, right? But, in fact, his career abounded in paradoxes. He was a four-star general who never fought in combat, an extraordinary politician who never ran for office, a military man who thought as a civilian most of the time. Above all, he had the capacity of dealing effectively with both the lowly and the mighty. And he was able to speak with people from all levels and communicate effectively. He expressed his ideas and analogies and folksy stories that fit his audience. He knew how to stand fast when necessary and when to trim. He was a master communicator. And this power only failed when he was confronted with the task of communicating with the radical youth of the 1960s. I mean, the fanaticism that these people had was simply beyond even Hershey's skill, although he did try. On many occasions, he would try to communicate with them. Now, his critics in the 1960s insisted that he was not a modern man, that he had been outpaced by new values and new problems in the nation. Of course, he did change. I mean, no man could remain in office for so long without adopting new methods, as he did, as Hershey did, for example, under Truman, with the deferment system, right, for the Cold War. But in some sense, of course, his critics were right. He did have a core of beliefs when he left Indiana for Europe in World War I. These beliefs were decentralized authority and preferring private to public remedies. After all, he was a lifelong Republican, right? But he also believed in what the Greeks and Romans call citizenship, civitas, right? A sense of responsibility, of honor to the public trust, and of duty. Now, those kinds of values brought sort of smirks to the sophisticated rebels of the 1960s. But it remains to be seen whether any civilization in this century or the next can survive the absence of these virtues from its citizenry. When Hershey left public office, he had many accomplishments to his credit. But most importantly, he kept the faith with his values, and his integrity was intact. Would that such could be said of more public officials after a much shorter tenure. Thank you very much.
Professor Flynn will be with us the remainder of the afternoon and this evening at dinner. However, he would be willing to entertain a few questions if any would like to raise some now. Do we have questions for Professor Flynn?
Okay, the number 13 million men drafted during World War II.
Maybe we can compromise. I think it's 13 million, but I'd have to go check, but I think it's 13 million. They didn't all serve, of course, right? Drafted. I mean, one of the problems, you talk figures. I had a little manuscript article in Scribner's New Encyclopedia of the American Military. The editors gave me all kind of problems because there are so many different figures that come down on how many people were in the Army or in the Navy at a certain time. But in the draft, of course, you get an induction notice, all right? There's so many of those that go out, right? Then there are those people that show up to take their physical, so that's another figure. And there are those that actually pass their physical, right? And those that actually serve, right? So there are all kinds of different figures, but let's not get upset about 3 million. I'll check it again, but I think it's 13 million. Okay.
As a veteran, I remember 13 million, but I think when we considered the Navy and the Marines, at the time that I entered the service, you had to enlist, you had to volunteer for the sub duty, for Marine duty,
one of the things about the Navy and the Marines, of course, is that they do, in fact, use the draft. You see. I mean, but what they do is they use it indirectly, in the sense that the draft frightens people into enlisting in the Navy and the Marines. Now, in World War II, Roosevelt and Secretary of Navy Knox both wanted to continue voluntary enlistment, which was creating havoc. I mean, the whole idea of having a draft was so that you could be efficient about using your manpower. I mean, we don't want this nuclear physicist rushing off to join the Marines, right, to invade Iwo Jima. And yet what's happening is that these people are enlisting in the Navy and in the Marines. So finally, the voluntary system ends, and the Army, of course, kept complaining because, essentially they were skimming off the cream, getting the best talent. So in World War II, this ends, but not in the Korean War, and not in the Vietnamese War. I mean, it's possible to continue to enlist. But, Admiral Byrd, for example, when I talked to him, he was CNO at one time, and he said, "This draft is terrific. Keep it up. We use it. It's wonderful for us." Right? When the head of the Navy Reserves testified once that 75% of their enlisted ranks in the Navy Reserve were directly draft motivated when they surveyed them. I asked them, "Why did you join the Navy?" They said, "Get the draft into the Army." So how do you count that? Those indirect figures. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The readings that I received included the statement that your friends and neighbors have chosen you to represent them. I wonder if that is something that Hershey phrased himself.
I don't know. It's certainly at one with the sentiments that had in fact been developed by the Joint Army-Navy Committee. See, the idea was that you wanted to share this responsibility, right? This was not an agreeable idea to tell Mrs. Jones' son that, hey, we're going to take you. Mrs. Jones might get upset at that. So the idea was that you shared the responsibility. This is what Hershey tried to tell Nixon, that you don't want to make this too national, because then all the opposition to conscription will be directed at national figures. So make it the local people that are doing it, right? And then they take the heat, right? And what do they do when they take the heat? They say, well, Washington made us do it, right? Okay. But at least it's a shelter belt for it. So I don't know who designed the actual wording, but the wording was critical in implementing this kind of federalistic system that was designed early in the game. And the idea was around in World War I as well, that they wanted to make the local people more responsible, but they were much more responsible in World War II than they were in World War I.
Would you comment on the president's statement?
Well, I'm sure that we have a couple of officials here from the system. They can tell you much more. Well, I don't think that. It seems it's remarkable that we even have it doing what it's doing. We have such an anti-military tradition in this country. An idea that the British are the same way. Of course, they gave up conscription. And the French have it, but for many different reasons. It's tied into the whole concept of the state, the revolutionary state. And we don't have that. And the idea of having any kind of conscription without a war in the United States, I think, is politically impossible. This is just speculation. But given our traditions, I don't see there's a chance of that. It came back, of course. Carter reinstituted it, and then Reagan kept it going, the registration, and Clinton hasn't appointed his own man to head up the system. That doesn't seem to me to be a very good sign of its future viability. Maybe Lou has some other ideas on that. Okay. Yeah.
Dr. Flynn, I'd just like to elaborate on one of your comments, that the local people might be interested. You About content and subjection too. I remember him saying he put Louis Koch in
Yeah.
as head of that because Koch was an immigrant, or the son of an immigrant. He knew what it was like to be discriminated against, and he
Right.
it showed the humanism of this man.
Yes, that's right. He was very sensitive to.
One other thing, it's probably not on paper in the research, but when the general talked about the putting selective service in deep stand
Mm-hmm.
by making it opposite selective service records, he indicated that there was a tacit agreement with President Truman that was to keep the machinery from rusting as well as to keep the records. Now this is from the general. You have other information.
Yeah. Well, I'm skeptical of that because, I mean, I did see some documents in which Truman is writing in an irritated vein that the general is doing all this training and that he's not supposed to be doing this. I mean, there were some documents in which he...
Of course, UMT was recommended by Washington.
Yeah.
Every president until modern times. And the
Yeah,
Congress
yeah.
passed
No, that's, yeah.
it without politically.
Right.
But I enjoyed your book and I enjoyed your talk very much. Some of these little things
Yeah.
come up from personal.
Sure. Right. Well, send me a list of them. Maybe in the next edition. When we make the movie, we'll make those changes, all right?
We're going to get ours published first.
Okay. Oh, okay. The real story. Okay. Any other questions? Well, thanks again for inviting me. Enjoyed it very much.
On behalf of all of us, thank you, Professor Flynn. We have one more official thing that we would like to do this afternoon. Dr. Geddick has a presentation to make.
I think it's apropos, Irene.
Thanks, and let me compliment you on the wisdom that you passed out there. And
Well-
the knowledge of it was astounding. Of course, I guess I did a little for you for a while, but you didn't
Well,
just do it yourself.
I noticed the ribbons. I have a few of those, but I pale into insignificance when I put mine on, which includes the Purple Heart, if you haven't noticed. I don't see a congressional medal, so somebody missed it.
Yeah, can't win them all.
Well, and I even want to argue a little bit with our historian. He's a little bit contemporary. You know, I notice he's younger than we are.
A lot of people are.
Because I was on the campus with a deferment in engineering, and I enlisted. So it didn't have anything to do with reading. So on behalf of the board and the university, a very small token for the importance of General Hershey. But this is from all of us here at the university, remembrance of him and his family.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to thank all the people here. I know how proud my father was of all the people he worked with, lived with, grew up with. Of course, he was a native son, as it's been pointed out by George. And I just can't thank you enough for what you've shown for him.
Yeah, and we want to thank Gil for his service to the country also, as well as having an illustrious father.
Well, thank you. Dinner will be served this evening at 5:30 at the Zollner Clubhouse. The reception that started before this event continues after this event upstairs. We also have a special exhibit of Hershey memorabilia in our library, and you're certainly invited to go over and view that exhibit. And we also invite you to take another visit to the Hershey Museum. As Gil certainly remembers, his father did. Visited the museum the evening before he passed away here in Angola. On Monday, if you're still here, we have a historian from the Selective Service, Danny Johnson, who's here with us right now. You might raise your hand, Danny. And he will be giving a lecture, we call it a noon talk, on our campus in Best Hall, and you're certainly invited to attend that. And how am I doing, Butch? I think the only thing I need to mention to you, for those of you that are interested in being in transportation from this end of the campus to the west end of the campus, we have transportation arranged for you, and those persons conducting that transportation are available at the library.
And the reception.
And the reception area. With that, anything else?
I want to introduce two people quickly.
Okay.
I'll lose one of them. So.
Fine. And then would you put
There are
it?
so many people to thank and recognize for what's happening now. Two I do want to point out right now, because I think we're going to lose one of them. The displays you're going to see were put together by two people. The original displays go back to 1971, and we heard her speak. Peggy Bush, Peggy, marvelous job organizing all this stuff. And you'll see another display that has just recently been put up, was just completed Friday, and a young lady volunteered on the campus to get involved with that. I don't know if she's going to stay with us, but Marcia Hooker, would you put your hand up? Marcia, you did a marvelous job. We'll have opportunities for those who want to say something about their experience with General Hershey, get on video, and we hope you'll take advantage of that this afternoon in the library or this evening at dinner. So there'll be plenty of opportunity to say what's on your mind here, folks, and please continue to enjoy the festivities today at the reception, and be sure to see what's in the library and down at Hershey Hall.
Thank you, Butch, and thank you all for attending. This official.
Edward R. Hershey. I am living in Jacksonville, North Carolina. I went into the Marine Corps for the early part of World War II. I was commissioned in 44 and accepted for regular commission at the end of the war. I put in 31 years service, had an active campaigns in World War II, Korea. In fact, I made 2 trips to Korea and got shot all to pieces there. And then in Vietnam, I was in Vietnam for a year, commanding the 4th Marine Regiment. I retired in 1972 after 31 years of service. I have 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. The boy is Rose B. Hershey II. They're scattered now. As I mentioned, I live in Jacksonville. One of them lives, and one of the youngsters lives in Atlanta, Georgia. That's my oldest daughter. My son is now living in western North Carolina, which is clear across the state from where I live. I'm on the coast. But he just recently moved there. He was out in Missouri for some little time on the faculty at the university there. My other daughter, who is the middle child, she was not here for this. Unfortunately, school is just getting underway, and she's a professor in eastern Minnesota University up in Duluth. She has 2 little children. My older daughter has 1 child. My son does not have any children at this time.
I wanted to ask you, wait, should he hold this? Is this man?
That's okay.
Okay, that's picking up. I wanted, how old were you when you went into the service?
19.
19. Did your father encourage or discourage, or whose decision was it that you?
Oh, it was mine. He certainly wouldn't have tried to force anything on it. But I think he was rather proud that I did. Is there anything else?
Yeah, and I was wondering just how you feel about today's event and the commemoration.
I think that was just beautiful, a wonderful thing. And I'm just proud of all of the folks here who put this together. And I'm glad that they allowed me to come to it.
Oh, well, it's our treat. You guys are all so nice. enjoyed it, and I wish, like, didn't get to know your dad, but everybody, as we were talking about this in town, and people remember him, and everybody has, I mean, he must have had a very powerful personality.
Yes, but not the overwhelming type.
Mm-hmm.
Not that at all. In fact, he could build up the confidence in somebody as well as anybody I can think of.
How was he during the Vietnam War? And you were there. You were in the war, and I know. And he was a target of a lot of anger. I know. How was that on the family?
Well, I think that it hurt him a lot, but this I think it was typical of him. And roll with the punch and keep doing what you think you have to do.
Mm-hmm.
And have thick skin if you're going to have them.
I was impressed. I know I read in the prologue of Flynn's book when your dad was, 1970, so he was fairly up in years. And,
Yes.
And he spoke to a crowd of students at UCLA, and that was a very courageous
Mm-hmm.
thing to do.
Yes. But he didn't back down from things like that. He didn't get nasty. In fact, he could kind of turn some of these things around and maybe make them feel funny the way he could turn them around.
Yeah. Did I was going to ask you something. When you were in Vietnam, okay,
Mm-hmm.
did you, and people knew who your father was, did you get
Any static from it? Oh, no. No, I didn't. But as a regimental commander, and we were right up on the front line along the DMZ,
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to give you a lot of static about something like that?
Right, other priorities. Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And during the job, what could they say? Oh, I can remember World War II. A couple of kids. I heard this second or third hand. I just made a lieutenant and was platoon commander, and they said, one Hershey drafts me, now I have to go the other one to fight. But he didn't say it to me, and it was said second or third hand in a laughing manner.
You got those guys coming and going,
The,
didn't you?
the youngster, I think he was, well, I'm making out twice.
Hershey's, they're everywhere. Oh, now, but one final thing, if you would, tonight at the dinner, after we eat, we're going to ask some people if you'd share a special memory about your dad. Would you mind doing that?
All right, well, let me think about it.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I'd mention it to you now, and you think about it, and then I'll just ask you, I won't put you on the spot, but if, I'll come up to you before the dinner, and if you think you'd like to,
All right,
we'll do it then.
I'll give it a go.
Yeah,
Mhm.
okay. Something you want to share. Okay. Is there anything that you would like to say, something about your dad or about
Well, thinking for the record. Is
Yeah.
Mhm. Well, there's just so many things to sort out.
Mm-hmm.
Some, he was a great father. It's as simple as that. But he had such a wonderful understanding of people. It's no wonder. I do wonder how he put up with me. I was a kid growing up, but not much of a student. But he always kept me around. He fed me or had me fed. Made sure that he didn't throw me out. And,
I can't imagine. I bet you were nice to have around too.
oh, I was a brat.
Were you?
Oh, sure.
Was that because? Well, did you guys move around a lot with your dad?
Oh, yeah. Well, we moved. Of course, we moved on a very regular basis, if you will. But he wasn't on long deployments. There were places they had to go out maybe for 3 or 4 weeks and come back.
Mm-hmm.
But now in my own family, 6-month cruises. Our units had a regular 6-month cruise. Out of a 2-year stay, you had maybe one 6-month cruise.
Mm-hmm.
When I say cruise, we kept not detachments, but Marine landing forces aboard the Mediterranean fleet ships. And when I was at Camp Lejeune, we were continually turning over battalions out there. And then, of course, when I went off to war, now I wasn't married when I went off to World War II, but I was married when both times I was in Korea and when I was in Vietnam.
Didn't you think you were pushing your luck to go to so many wars?
Well,
especially after Korea, you said that's where you were injured.
my feeling was that that's what I was being paid to do. And quite frankly, I was conceited enough to feel that I could take a group of men, whether we're talking about a platoon or a squad or a regiment, that I could take those men out, bring more of them back than the next guy, and get the job done.
Well, that's what you need. Well, thank you.
As I say, I was discontent, I suppose, when I wasn't able to, and that's why I worked my boat to get back to Korea. I felt, look, that's our war. I'm supposed to be out there.
That's different. And what happened to you? How were you injured there? Can I ask you that? Or?
Yes, I got hit by 3 heavy mortar shells. I was on top of the hill out in front of the lines. In fact, I took one of the squad leaders. I wanted to show him he was going to take out the patrol that night. I wanted to show him just where to take the patrol. And I had worked my way up to the top of this hill. He was about 10, 12 yards behind me. I was lying down because I was looking over the hill. And these 3 heavy mortar rounds came in on top of me. Apparently they hit just behind me because it mostly drove everything up here and here and all over. The boy that was with me was back about 10 yards in a little, what we call a spider hole. It was dug out. But he was down in it. He had his arm torn off. That was his only injury, but he lost his arm. So,
no wonder you're able to walk or anything.
Oh,
And your spine.
I'm too ornery not to.
See, it pays to be a brat sometimes.
I guess so. But this boy that lost his arm, he called. He said, they've got my arm. We had 2 other men that had accompanied us, but they were clear down at the bottom of the hill. And I couldn't move. I was just like I was pinned to the ground. But they came up and they wanted to know how I was. And I said, will you get the sergeant out of here and get him back, please? See if we can't save that arm. And they said, what about you? And, well, when you get back, send somebody out with a stretcher.
They did much better than I would have done. I'm afraid. Well, you were the right person for the job. Thank you. Oh, good. Did you ever hear from that young man? Do you keep in touch much with some
Well,
people?
not that much. Yes, in fact, when I was medevac, taken back to the hospital ship, for the first year or so, I got old letters from half the company. I was company commander at the time. But I'm afraid I tried to answer them, but and it kind of fell off. So.
Yeah, it's hard to keep in touch. Well, listen, thank you. I don't want to keep you too long. You think about tonight, something,
All right.
if there's a special memory.
Something relating to my dad that might be
share
worth something humorous.
Yeah.
All right.
Nice. Oh, good.
Well, I'll give it a go.
Frederick is in the middle, and we have some friends around here that are Frederick, so I just thought I'd bring that up. But I'm the second son, of course. Gil is the older boy, and I'm in the middle because my sister Kitty is the oldest, then Gil, and myself, and then Ellen Margaret.
Okay. And did you mentioned your middle name was Frederick, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could you kind of just tell us about your short engagement?
I was 7 years old, and some very good friends of my family, especially my dad, I guess, were out in California visiting, and we'd been in El Paso, Texas, because that's where my dad had been stationed. And we met them up in Hollywood. And Eileen Frederick, that was, of course, her maiden name. And I just had a little romance, I guess, because we walked around Hollywood, and I was looking for a ring. We said we were engaged, and I guess we were gone long enough that people got worried that I was lost, or maybe both of us. I don't know.
Kind of worldly for us.
Well, that
It was Hollywood, though.
I don't know. I can't tell you that. I was only 7. I didn't realize that was my age, but I guess that's what it comes down to.
And now, had you seen her recently?
Never
Right.
seen her since then.
Until today?
That's right.
Oh, wow.
But of course, as soon as she said Eileen Frederick, of course, the fact that my middle name is Frederick, maybe because the family was such good friends. I'm not sure where I got the name, and I can't find out now. I don't know anybody that can help me there. But
Well, that's a good explanation as any. Okay. Well, now, you were with the service, too. If you could kind of just give me a little background on yourself, on your military background.
I went to the Merchant Marine Academy in 1944, beginning of January of 1944. And when I graduated, they took or most of our class into the Navy, about 65%. So I was commissioned in the Navy, and I guess I went in 43 because I was commissioned in June of 1944. And I went to the Pacific on a battleship. And
How long were you in the Pacific?
From then through the end of the war, and another. Let's see, I got out of the Navy in October of 46, I guess.
Okay. Now, Gil said that he was surprised his dad put up with him as a child. He said he was a real brat. Now, is that true?
Well, I think we're on tape. I shouldn't say that, you know. He broke my nose. He abused me a little bit. In fact, I think one of the things I remember, he said, George, if we sprung from 8, you didn't jump far enough. But he was always a joker.
Well, I'll ask you another question I asked him. You got into the military. Now, do you think your dad influenced you at all to do that? Or
The war influenced.
You know?
The boys couldn't wait to get in. We even went down to, they were living in Washington, D.C., and I was, of course, living there. And I remember going down to the Canadian Embassy to see about joining. That's our CAF. And this is before we got into the war, because they said when the U.S. gets into the war, you can transfer over. But you had to have parents' permission. Anyway, all the kids wanted to
join.
get in when they were old enough.
Very different in the 60s and 70s.
Well, it was a big war.
Yeah.
And it makes a difference when you get jumped on like Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, it does. What about, do you have any particular thoughts about what we're doing here today with this?
Well, I feel very privileged to have been able to come back and come to a country that, of course, I'm quite familiar with through my childhood and later, and the tribute that they're paying to my father I think it's just great.
We're very happy you're here. Would you mind, I don't know, later today at the dinner, we're thinking about, asking family members to share some memory about your dad. Would you be willing, or would you mind if I asked you at that point to share something?
I'll have to think of something that's appropriate, but I really do appreciate what Tri-State has done and how much it meant to him and to my mom, too, of course.
Yeah.
So.
Yes, she was from this area, too, and a lot of people. They were a real favorite. The editor for the Herald Republican here in town, she remembers that as a little girl, your dad coming into town on the limo, and it was always a big event, He came back, he was a favorite.
He always came back.
Yeah.
Right to the end.
That's right. And in fact, we have some pictures. Did you send them back that was taken of your dad the night before he died?
No, that's probably Gil, because Gil was with him. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Gil and his wife came in a private plane out of Washington, because I was in Washington, and I went just back on leave or something, I forget. No, it's because my dad had a stroke. I'd gone back, and somebody that's connected with Tri-State had this jet aircraft that they, so Gil and his wife and dad came out for, I guess it's graduation, I'm not sure. And, but Dad passed away the day before.
Yeah, but it was graduation, so I think it was in May or something that he came out. Now, where are you from? Where do you live now?
I live in Washington State, Bremerton, Washington, which is near Seattle.
Your daughter is Kathleen Cadillac.
Yeah, no, that's Suzanne Cadillac.
Suzanne.
I have Kathleen, she's Cartwright.
Yeah, okay.
And then I have a Barbara Jean Bond.
Okay.
So the 3 daughters and no sons.
Yeah.
Three son-in-laws with 7 grandchildren, so.
You're doing just fine.
Yeah.
Well, I talked to Suzanne on the phone. She was very nice.
Oh,
yeah.
right.
And
Okay, she's the
books.
Cadillac.
Is she here?
No, she wanted to come, and it just wasn't
I
really
know.
practical. The kids just started school. She has a young daughter, and she has a boy 15 and a daughter about 10 or 11. So,
Okay. Yeah, but she was so nice to talk to on the phone. I talked to her a couple different times.
well, the reason she got into this talking, her son was going to make a report, and so he decided to make it on my dad. And originally, the books that Tri-State carried, the paperback, we had the hardcover ones. And she couldn't find hers, so she got a hold of somebody here and asked how could she get a book, and they put us in touch with the author, and we ended up buying about 100 of them, but then distributing them between the. But that's how she happened to be calling to get a copy of that book for him to.
Oh, okay, well, you tell her. I said, hi, I'm sorry I didn't get to meet her.
Well, I know she
it
was like.
Dr. Cyberling, one who wrote the book. He's an interesting person, too.
Yes, I was hoping maybe you'd be here, but.
Yeah, I do, too. But I think he's going to. He also does a lot with cowboy.
He sent me a pamphlet of comics. It says Idol or whatever. But he said he was working on something, gathering everything he could on comics. And anyway, I wrote him because I'd gotten some pictures from him that they used in making that book, and I told him yes, I'd like those, and of course I wanted the other books too. And I told him I hoped I'd see him at the at this anniversary date. But
doesn't always work out. But I'm glad
but he's from Hershey, Pennsylvania, at least at that
He
time.
said you were related to Milton Hershey.
Somewhere.
Well, way back a ways.
Yeah. We always said, yeah, he's probably 180th cousin, twice removed or whatever. But the folks did stop there, and they had met him and got a tour, I guess. I've been through town, but I never got the tour.
Yeah, well, you got to take it. It's your namesake.
Well, it's kind of a long way from home, though.
No, it's a long way from Washington.
Of course, it's nothing compared to my sister coming from Hawaii, but it's,
I need to get her in here, too.
yeah.
Ellen, and then...
Well, they have their son here who's at Fort Leavenworth.
Yeah.
And, of course, Gil got 2 of his children here. And Kitty got 3, so they all did pretty good.
Yeah, no kidding. This is a good reunion for you guys.
Yeah, that's the first time we've really gotten the whole group together for anything outside of a funeral or something, you know.
This is better.
So this
better.
This works out good.
Oh, good. But I don't want to keep you from them any longer.
Okay, well, you'll probably have to tear up this bunch of film.
No. No, I think we might start out with this. If you would just want to go ahead now and introduce yourself, give your name and how you're related, and introduce the man next to you.
But say something first and then introduce.
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
Okay, and the only, you know what I was thinking, what about that bracelet with that banging, that might bang on the...
No, okay, I'll put my
keep it
hand.
down. Okay.
Yes, I'm Ellen Margaret Hershey Barth. I'm the youngest child also of the Hersheys, number 4 child. And I'd like to mention my dad was very sentimental. He used to give my mother a rose for every year they were married. So he got up to 59 roses. That was pretty good. And also, I'd like to mention this pendant I have on. It says on here, it says 1907, 10 September, and then 1969. And my mother and dad met that day, the first day of the 7th grade. And he never forgot it. So this was 62 years later, he gave Mother this pendant. I thought that's awfully sweet. And also this little bracelet I have has XXX, 30 years of marriage, and has her initials on the other side. So anyhow, that's the other side of Dad. And he was a very rounded person, and he used to say to me, "You're just as good as everybody else, but not one bit better." I thought that was pretty good advice. And Mother used to say of him, from the Kipling quote, "He could walk with kings nor lose the common touch." And I think that was very, very true. Now, I'd like you to introduce my husband. This is Colonel Sam Barth, who's carted me around the world for 30 years in the Army, and now we live in Hawaii.
Yes, when I first met General Hershey, I was a sergeant in the Army. And this lady dragged me out to the home to get acquainted. And I was impressed because I'd never been in a general's home before, but it didn't seem to make any difference. And the fact that I was a Hoosier boy, the same as he was, I think helped me get along with the family. General Hershey was usually never at a loss for words. But the day I told him that we wanted to get married, I thought that he didn't have anything to say for a longer period than I usually remember. So it's a great experience to be here today and share these things.
Yes, it really has been.
Thank you, sir. Well, I can't even think of anything else to ask you now, other than that, if there's any particular thing from, like when you were living at home with your dad, any special memory you can share now, or even tonight at the dinner.
If I could recall.
And if you could tell them, the people at the dinner, too, about your dad and the roses to your mom. That's beautiful. I think that's
Well.
Did anybody mention about him ironing?
Oh, the ironing. Oh, yes.
He did the laundry at home always.
Yeah, because mother was sick off and on, and Dad was very helpful with everything. And I can well remember in high school when he was the busiest with the selective service during the war, and he would be down in the kitchen. I'd come down for a glass of milk or something from study, and he'd be in there ironing the ironing because he didn't want Mother to do it. And that's the way he was all his life with her. And he spoiled her, really.
Oh, that's very unusual. I mean, really.
Yeah, well, he sure did.
You said that he was well-rounded. When I was going through our archives, and there's trustees, the minutes from the trustees meetings are here from 1884.
Oh, I bet.
And when your dad was here in 1911 or 1912, he made a special request, and they just noted it, that they have okayed for Louis Hershey to take Virgil, an extra course in Virgil. And, if you want to take extra hours, it had to be approved. So he really loves the classics to read, evidently.
He was interested in everything, and he was very interested in psychology. And I think that's one thing that helped him a lot with his job. He was always reading the latest books on psychology, and this was early enough that, psychology wasn't as prevalent as it is now. And I think that's why he understood people so well. He just really figured them out.
I'm almost surprised he didn't have a political career.
He was a politician, all right, but
yeah,
in his own way, he was.
Well, but I think he was a soldier first. It's just he knew how if he's going to make his system work, that it had to work through the political system. Of course, I think a lot of good soldiers at senior levels in Washington take the same approach. President Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff is a good example.
The new one, you mean
well, you're talking about Colin Powell.
Yeah, Colin Powell.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But he, I was just talking to a lady that worked in selective service, and she was saying it was just marvelous the way he could take a bunch of officers there at headquarters that were arguing about something, back and forth. He'd walk in there, and he'd settle them all down and smooth them out, and they'd come to a decision of some kind, which they had to do. She said it was amazing how he could do that. But that because he understood people, I think. He knew how to work it.
And he had some presence. I know I mentioned to George, I think, when I've been talking to people about this event, and even people that just barely know him or were really young when he would come to town, he'd come back and they said, or when General Hershey came in the limo, it was a big day and everybody went out to see him, but he made such an impact. He had such presence.
Well, he did that in his speech making. He was very, very popular for speech. He had speeches lined up a year or two ahead because he'd say, well, let's see, January 2 years from now, I'm going to be busy. He kind of joked about it. But he was so good with speeches. And I remember friends of ours who'd gone like American Legion Convention or something. They said he'd get a standing ovation every time he spoke because he was clever, he was witty, and he was interesting.
What he said, that he had the same speech that sometimes he'd begin at the beginning and go straight through, and sometimes he'd begin at the end and go backwards there. But
And sometimes he said he went in the middle and went both ways. And he came to visit us once, and you were a young lieutenant, learning to make speeches and things, and he whipped this 3x5 card out, and here's my speech I'm going to give in Denver. And, we couldn't believe it. He said, oh, yeah, that's all I needed. But he really enjoyed speaking.
The 3x5 cards remind me of how I used to carry them around to make notes on, and taught me. And here I am still carrying 3x5 cards around to make notes on.
But he loved to speak, and he liked to talk.
Was your mother comfortable in the public light at all?
Yeah, she was, but she was a more quiet person, and she wasn't a big joiner or anything, clubs and all, but she was very supportive of everything he did, and she was very happy that he was in the Army. She really enjoyed the Army.
I was interested. I read just a little bit of Flynn's book that she went off to the Philippines.
Right.
For a little adventure.
In 1913, because she was just a young girl, and she went out with her great uncle, who was at that time the deputy governor, and he had a daughter that she went out to be a companion to, and then she taught school in an Episcopal school in the Philippines for that year. She was like 20 years old, and she'd never been anywhere. I mean, I don't think she'd been out of Indiana.
No.
And of course,
that book anyway.
she thought that living over there was great, because those days, it was a house full of servants and things. That it was the old days. She thought, this is pretty good living. And no, but she enjoyed it. In fact, Dad got worried because she was running around with one of the governor's aides, and he thought maybe she wasn't coming back. But she did. He waited for her. She said he sure had to wait a long time. He didn't get around to.
Did she go into nursing too?
Yes, she did. In fact, she was in nursing when they got married. She had gone up to Chicago for nursing. Now, this was after the Philippines.
Yeah.
And they were engaged, and then they thought he was going overseas right away. So they got married, and she went back to nursing, but it was unofficial because she wasn't, those days you couldn't be married and taking nursing. Right. But then she had trouble with her feet and couldn't stand on her feet long.
They got married down at Camp Shelby, didn't they?
Well, yes, at Jackson, Mississippi, which is close to Camp Shelby. And then she went back to nursing.
Okay.
But then she had trouble with her feet, so she got out of nursing and went back to Angola, and then they announced their marriage, because then it was, of course, all right. Then he went overseas after that.
And that was World War I.
Yeah, he went over about 1918.
Yeah.
The war was almost over. So she went to work in Washington, D.C. She worked in one of the government agencies there while he was overseas. So that, kind of gave her a flavor, too. And I think she really wanted him to stay in the Army. She encouraged him to, and I think that made a lot of difference to him because of her opinion, sure.
Right.
So,
They sure did a good
Didn't they drive around the country visiting the Selective Service headquarters because they didn't like to fly?
well, she liked driving in the car. Well, she flew when she had to, but of course they were always traveling because they checked on all these draft boards all over the country, every headquarters in every state. The state headquarters. Constantly.
Well, now, were you still at home then?
I was still home part of that time, and I graduated from high school in '44 and went away to college, but I was back a lot, and then I was married and went to
how did you
college. Yeah, we were married while we were in college.
How'd we meet?
Yeah.
Well, my unit that I was in during World War II came back from Europe after the war was over. We were going to go to the Pacific. Fortunately, the Japanese surrendered, so we didn't have to go. And I was waiting to be discharged. And
another sergeant in my outfit and I were sharing a room at Fort Meade, Maryland, which is outside of Washington. And he was dating a friend of Ellen's, and he invited me into a party. No, she had a date.
Oh, yeah, I had a date. Just goes to show
She had
you,
a date. but
these
we-
Hoosier
I
boys,
met
you
her,
know, they
and
have
so-
their attraction, And we were married about a
Then we-
year later,
So you saw her at the party and
Yeah, I
That's
started
how
the
we
party
met.
and we danced.
through mutual friends, and then we started dating.
We shared the Indiana commonality.
Oh, sure. But anyway, so we were married a year later, and then I transferred from the University of Maryland to Indiana University because he was already re-enrolled because he had been there before the war.
Well, that's what upset our parents because we were still in college when we got married. And,
Well, it wasn't done then as much. This
well,
was
it
the
was
first
done,
bunch.
but the
First
veterans,
bunch.
which I was. and so-
yeah. Well, what
But-
did you study in school?
History. I was a history major.
How did you do anything? Did you teach?
No, I didn't. No, because
She taught 4 children.
I said, yeah, so you didn't do anything. It's not the
no,
right way
because
to say
when
it, I know.
when Sam graduated, we went right in the Army. That's what he wanted. He got a regular commission, and so then we started on our Army career, and we were sent to Germany about a year later. So
How'd
it
you
was
like that?
oh, loved it. We had 2 tours over there, 6 years total.
I have one of my girlfriends teaches like at an army base.
Yeah, yeah.
She's not coming back.
Where is she in Germany? Do you know?
Oh, I should know. No, I don't know the name of the place.
But it's fascinating. And of course, we were there right after the war, which was one
The
situation.
first time, yeah.
First time.
49.
Then we went back 9 years later, and it was a whole different country. It was just wonderful to see, what the Germans had done. And we went back to visit last year, and that was fun to go back and swap houses with the German families. So,
The Hershey's came to
Yeah.
visit us both times we were over there.
Yeah.
51 and again in
our first child was born over there, so they had to come and check in on the grandchild, of course. Yeah.
Oh, what a great grandparent.
Yeah. Oh, they were all.
They
Any
were,
place
they
you
were
went,
so
they were there.
interested in their
Yeah.
family.
And as soon as we would get one place, that they would come, whenever it was convenient, but right away if they could.
Oh, that's
They really, they did that with my brother when he was in the Marines too. And Dad used to write us kids every Sunday. He always wrote us every Sunday. If we were away and the 3 of us were gone, every Sunday he wrote us. And if he was extremely busy, he'd dictate it. But lots of the time he wrote it in longhand. I have all those letters, and it's just just bits of philosophy
Oh, I wish I could.
and birthday letters. He sent all of us. He had 13 grandchildren, and 4 of us kids, and our spouses. So he wrote birthday letters to the 8 children and the 13 grandchildren every year. These wonderful letter about how great you are.
What a guy. Oh, wonderful.
He was.
Well, thank you very, very
Oh,
much.
you're welcome. Did you run out of film?
We're not having.
All right, you just go ahead and please introduce yourself and tell me where you work.
My name is Scott Kohlhaas. I'm the chairman of Area Office 6, Local Board 28 in Indianapolis, and I work for Stone Container Corporation out of Indianapolis.
Okay, and what's your relationship to this Hunter service?
I've been on a draft board, a local board, for about 2 years now.
Okay, could you just give us an idea, because I know I don't have any idea what that means, or what do you do as a member of the draft board?
Actually, it's the easiest community service I've ever done. I'd like to get more involved, but it's just one weekend a year, continuation training, keeping us primed and up to date on all recent directives and laws and regulations concerning selective service, so that in the event of a draft, we're in place and ready to do our job.
Now, were you familiar with General Hershey prior to this? Could you just tell me about?
Yes. As a matter of fact, I'm really lucky to be here. I was reading Mr. Flynn's book on General Hershey, and I noticed that his birthday was September 19th, and 1893.
Oh,
So I
September
knew.
12th.
Well, actually, his birthday's 19th.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is. But anyway, and so I was wondering if there was going to be a commemoration. So I called my regional headquarters and asked, and they weren't sure. They thought there would be, but they checked, and they got back to me and said there was, and that I was invited. So, I feel kind of privileged and lucky to be here.
Oh, good. So you were just reading the book on your own?
Right.
Have you had a chance to speak with George Plan?
Yes, I have, and I thanked him for because I told him, it's his responsibility for me being here, technically. So, yeah, I was pleased to meet him, and I met the director of Selective Service, Robert Gambino, and I got my picture taken with him, so that was a thrill. And so I'll just go back to my board and just brag a little,
Well, what do you think? Just tell me about what you think of today's events here at Tri-State.
I'm impressed. It's a family reunion. I feel like I belong in one way because I'm continuing what he started, and yet it's kind of fun to just be an observer from the outside too, and just see the family members, and the family resemblance is incredible, and a lot of second cousins, fourth cousins, and it's just really nice to meet them, and I know they support what we're doing, so it's a good time.
And what's your opinion, this is about my last question, of the General's impact on the Selective Service?
General Hershey?
Right.
Well, he was Selective Service, and what more can I say? His influence was tremendous, and I was reading about him because I am fascinated with the whole issue of manpower mobilization, and of course, with my involvement in Selective Service, he's like, I wouldn't say an idol, but he's someone that I could definitely learn from and have. And it's interesting, it's good to have a historical perspective, as we go on into the future and know what went on in the past. So my impression of General Hershey is a strong impression. I'm happy to be part of what he built.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, that'll do, I think.
The Indiana State Representative for District 51, which covers all of Steuben County and also part of DeKalb County and a little bit of LaGrange County. And I've lived in this area all of my life, and I've known of General Hershey since I was a little boy, and looked up to him as one of our local heroes, and I think he still has that image in my mind today. I think the Tri-State University has done a great thing in having this special commemoration of his 100th birthday, and I was glad to be invited and to be here today because I think he was a great American, and I'm involved in politics, and I think he was a great politician even though he never ran for an elective office and didn't campaign for that type of office, but I still think he really got along with people well. He knew how to deal with people and how to negotiate things, and I think we can be very proud here in this part of Indiana that he was born and raised here and came back here and spent a lot of time here even in his later years, and we appreciate him very much and are very thankful for his service to the United States of America and to Indiana and to Tri-State University and the Angola community here. I think the university has a great legacy that he was a member of their Board of Trustees, and he also was a graduate here. I think that's probably going to be one of the greatest things that Tri-State University has for years and years and years to come. We are involved in a lot of things here in the community, and I think it's good to be able to have someone who's kind of a famous person to be able to identify with the local community here, and I think it's been a great advantage for us to be able to say this is where General Hershey was from, and I just appreciate being able to be here today and being a part of this great celebration.
Excellent. Into the camera.
Okay. Well, my name, you just want to get my name. Jim Zimmerman, professor of history at Tri-State University. I guess my first involvement with Hershey's connection to Tri-State was as a professor in 1973, taken to Best Hall by a colleague and shown the massive amount of Hershey papers and memorabilia that had been presented to us by General Hershey. And I was told at the time that I might be invited with others to somehow adapt that material to an archival facility. They already had the museum facility here at the university. Well, that didn't happen. The next thing I heard some years later was that the material went on to the Carlisle Barracks. I think what's important about today that the university commemorate someone who made the contribution that General Hershey did in the service of his country. That connection, that role, the importance of that was certainly very much highlighted by Professor Finn today. I think for us, it's sort of a wake-up call to recognize what it is that we have on this campus in the way of a resource that we need to be about the business of better utilizing. And so, from that standpoint, I'm interested from that standpoint of we here on the campus, signaling ourselves to be better attentive to the Hershey material.
Okay. Is there something? Why don't you just make some remarks about how you felt meeting with him, kind of thing, getting to meet, George and Dad.
Actually, I've been so busy with the the minutia of things that are related to an event of this kind that I didn't have much of an opportunity for reception to circulate. That's what I'm trying to say. I did after the meeting. I've had an opportunity to meet with two of the children, but only very briefly. So I'm looking forward to this evening. I find these people, the ones that I've met, to be a reflection of the general, at least as he's described. My own personal recollections of General Hershey are minimal as a young faculty person here. Mm-hmm. I'm sure I have some recollection of meeting him in a reception line or something along those lines, but never really any direct encounters.
That's funny. I mean, that's exactly what I think of meeting Gilbert and George and Alan. And they're very warm, they're good storytellers.
Yes.
Just the kind of attitude you'd hear for their dad, I think have been passed down to them. They're good people.
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's probably, unless there's anything you want to tack on or add.
No, I don't think so. I think it's important for him to get on down to
let's go.
To Hershey.
Okay. Thanks, Jim.
Okay.
And then one of us would say, "Oh, is this her?" Yeah, but she ran the. That was a long time. She was.
They evacuate you. Other people say, I want to stay one. Frank Barth. I'm the grandson of Louis B. Hershey. I'm in the United States Army. I'm stationed at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The same school that my grandfather went to 60 years ago, where my father went to 30 years ago. We really enjoyed the events of the day, being able to see old friends and family, and also to see the impact that Louis Hershey had on so many people, his contributions to his country. I know him as a grandfather who would go ride on my bike together, a person that could treat a 6-year-old just like if he was head of state, and a person I am very proud of. This is my wife, Beth, my son, Colin, my son, Brandon. You guys have anything you want to say?
No. We unfortunately did not have the opportunity to know General Hershey when he was alive, but we've been trying to learn his history through Frank, as well as through all the events of the day. So we're coming from Kansas to introduce our children to their great-grandfather and learning about Frank's grandfather.
You guys want to say anything?
Well, why don't you tell us how old you are?
How old are you?
6. We're glad you came.
We won't hold that against them. One thing that's interesting is Louis Hershey's had a great involvement in scouting, and we're kind of carrying on that tradition. Colin's a Tiger Cub. Brandon is in his 3rd year. He's a Bear Scout, Cub Scout, and I'm a den leader, and Beth's a coordinator for Tiger Cubs.
So I'm a tiger woman.
Tiger Cubs.
Thank you. No, that's a different
System, and
Tim, okay. Hello, I'm here with Director Robert Gambito with the Selective Service System, and he was kind enough to join us today for the commemoration of General Louis Blaine Hershey's 100th birthday. Thank you for being here.
I'm delighted to have been invited to participate in the celebration of General Hershey's 100th